Well, welcome everybody to this week's edition of the I5L1CU, the podcast for nonprofit board members. This is Michael Corley, and Reed and I are going to do something a little bit different today. We're just going to riff with each other on what Reed has learned and what we've learned as we've interviewed, good Lord, probably about 16 guests over the last 6+ months, in addition to my individual podcast. So we're just going to see where this goes, see what Reed has learned as a young person who's just really new into the nonprofit space and understanding board responsibilities, roles, and things like that. Reed, welcome. How are you doing today?
Doing very well, and I think, we've had at least 16 guests on, I would say. This is going to be episode 31. So, we've had a lot of expertise on the show, a lot of opinions, and a lot of different viewpoints that have come in and, shed some light on this mysterious landscape that is the nonprofit board world. So,
well, I'm excited about this, and it's interesting. You call it mysterious. It probably is to you. Sometimes when you've been in it so long, like I have, and a number of our listeners, you forget things. And so this is going to be a good refresher course from one perspective, but we'll also have an opportunity to learn things, I'm sure. So why don't we just jump right in and see where this goes? So Reed, well, I know you've listened, you've participated in these podcasts, you're learning about boards, you've gone to retreats. What's your first observation about nonprofit board leadership, membership, if you will?
So before we even hop into there, I think it might even be good to level set on what I originally would have thought being a board member was all about before I got involved in any of this. And you can go back and listen to the episode about the 4 misconceptions of being on a nonprofit board. And I think that those 4 misconceptions are pretty consistent with what I would imagine I believe before all of this. And so number one would probably be thinking that you have to be rich or wealthy or have a lot of expendable money to be able to give to the organization.
Good point.
I also probably would have thought that you would have had to be really influential. I probably would not have thought about how much time you have to give to the organization.
Sure.
Thinking that you have to be less engaged. And lastly, probably think that it is only for a select group of people, that, it's those who are late in their career, it's those who are established, and that young people or that it isn't necessarily open to everybody. So those are all things that I probably would have thought beforehand, and all of those myths have been busted, so to say. And now I'll go into, I have about 6 points of things that I've learned. So
let me jump in there for a second before you go into those. I think that's great observations. I want to piggyback on that last one, and that's, it's a old man sport, if you will. It's not for the young, and it's really contrary. If you remember, we did one podcast on why it's one of the best leadership development opportunities available is for a young person to become a member of a nonprofit board. And that may be easy to say, but in reality, it is possible to everybody. If there's an interest, there is a way to work your way onto a nonprofit board. You want to be strategic, you want to be genuine, but certainly the opportunity's available. So I'm glad you said that, Reed. So, all right.
Yeah. And to continue off of that, now that we're in this, I am aware of younger people who are on boards, or they're on committees, or they're involved in organizations in some way or another, being groomed, so to say, to be on the board one day. So it is much more clear now that we've been in this world, that I've been in this world for a little bit, that it is possible for, young people and early professionals to, step onto a board position and still provide some value.
Yeah, and I get asked a lot. I counsel young people who are interested in being on boards and they're worried about the time commitment and the impact of work. I say, no, look, your career comes first. You really do have to focus on that. If you're in your 20s, 30s, even into your 40s, that's really important. But you've got an opportunity to give back, to serve, to use this as leadership development. So serve on one board. Do not get on multiple boards. Go all in, be effective on one board. I think Kathy Layton talked about it in one of our podcasts, is go deep and be known as somebody who's a contributor and, not a placeholder, and it will really transform your career and help your growth and then give you an opportunity to give back to your community.
And seeing other people lead too. I think that just from me not even being on a board, but being in some of the meetings has been invaluable, just to hear firsthand what some of these established leaders think about in this environment. So I think that that's invaluable too.
Yeah, indeed. All right, so we deviated a little bit. That's why we're riffing, which is, I guess, a new age term for just ad hoc, just going off the top of your head. But let's jump right in. You said you had 6. Let's start off with number 1, and let's go from there.
So my first major thing that I've realized since starting this is that a good board member, a great board member, is an engaged board member. They give their talents, their treasures, and time, and they're a doer, a door opener, and a donor. And
well, good Lord, you're just Mr. Alliteration, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, we've had multiple guests say those sayings, and it's a great way to picture what it is that a person can give, and super memorable. I didn't have to go back and listen to any podcast to remember that.
Very good.
I think that really frames what it is to be a good and engaged board member.
Well, I think you're right. I can't say it any better, and I love the alliteration because it is memorable. It reminds me and it lets people know it is service. You will have to do something. You should, like we said a few minutes ago, you don't just get on a board to get on a board. It's an opportunity to serve your community in one of those capacities that you just mentioned. Like it. Go ahead, Reed.
The second item is that the best board meetings are those that tackle strategic problems. They start on time and end on time. They utilize a consent agenda, and just remembering that every board member on the board has something else that they could be doing, and that you need to make those board meetings worth those individuals' time. That's one of the best recruiting tools to get people on your board, is to have effective board meetings. Nobody's going to want to come for a second term or, go above and beyond if your meetings are already running an hour and a half late and they're already giving more time there. So I think that that could not be emphasized enough, and that's something that I never would have thought of beforehand, even knowing any of this. I just figure that, I guess they're structured anyways, but actually having structure, starting on time, ending on time, using a consent agenda are all great things to do in order to have an effective board meeting.
Absolutely. It's a sign of professionalism. It's a sign of respect for people's time. It's a sign of preparation that you start on time, end on time, and you have a very structured and focused meeting. If you want to recruit the cream of the crop in your communities, you really do need to run a good board meeting. It's a shame there are so many that don't know how to run it. Go get some professional training, coaching. Go learn how to run a board meeting. I tell you what, that is like the secret sauce. You will be a hero if, like Reed said, you start on time and end on time. If you do nothing else but that, people will love you. But use that time wisely for strategy and not to get into the weeds. That's what staff's for.
And that comes, mostly from our Brian Deming episode, who said all of those things. And I think the key message from that episode is that your role as a board chair is facilitator. So if the meetings are not effective, the board chair needs to direct them in an effective way.
Yes. Yeah, it's not the CEO's responsibility, although if you have a strong CEO who's running things, which is fine, sometimes that is the model, it's not their job. It is the board chair's job. And so that's why it's critically important you get the right board chair in place, and that person is prepared, maybe even trained on how to do that. It's an important role.
Yes, it is. And it's one of those things where you can learn good habits from the person prior to you, or you can learn bad habits from that person. So,
very good.
I think as a board chair, you can switch things up and do things the way that you want to do them if you think that that's going to lead to more effective board meetings, more engaged board members, and a better overall organization.
Sure, as long as you're focused on mission. Yeah. What's up next, Reed?
A good board or organization will provide its board members with their expectations. This might include anything from participation level, board meeting attendance, event attendance, donation frequency or amount if that's required by the organization, how many people they're expected to connect to the organization, and or if they're required to be on a committee. Cheryl Taylor listed a ton of items that people should ask before joining a board. So you can kind of do the digging on, what the expectations are, but I think the best boards will provide that information without the person having to ask for it.
Yeah, you want to make sure it's a cultural fit for you. And you're right, the expectations, it's akin to accepting a new job, a new position, you want to know what the expectations are. And just because these people are maybe pillars of the community and they come on, that you should not be intimidated by them. They still need to go through an orientation process. The expectations need to be set because you want them to be successful. And also, you don't want chaos to be caused. But I tell you what, a lot of board chaos read is caused by people just not understanding what the expectations are or were, the roles, the responsibilities. And it's really a shame because it becomes a big distraction, a big waste of time. People get frustrated. It permeates the organization. And it just doesn't need to be if you take the time to set the right expectations.
And I guess even a part of that is understanding the roles and responsibilities of a board member. We've been in a number of meetings, I don't want to make it sound like it's a lot, but definitely a few where we're talking about programs and, board members are giving their opinions on how best to do a program and we're just like, we're thinking high level here. We are not getting in the weeds. That's the CEO's job. That's the employee's job. We need your oversight. And maybe at some point there's a place and time for your opinion on programs or how best to do something, but it's not at a board meeting. It's not at a board retreat, I would assume.
Now, you want to stay at the strategic level. And what I often see, and boy, nothing's more frustrating to a CEO and or executive directors when board members start calling staff and giving them instruction. That is a big no-no. Board members, if you're listening, that is not your role. And I know it's tempting. You're accustomed to having things your way, and you're probably really good at it. But that undermines the CEO. It causes so much friction behind the scenes that you probably don't even know. That please don't do that. Go straight through the CEO, the executive director, if you have suggestions, comments, unless something's prearranged. Boy, that becomes really, really dangerous.
So moving on to the fourth point, and this is something that I might have thought about beforehand, but I'll just go into it. So board members should and are expected to bring in donations, whether that's from their own pocket, not from their business, but from their own pocket or through various connections that they have. And that's something that I think I knew ahead of time. But what's new to me is the way in which they can do that. And it has been emphasized in many board meetings that we've been in that you don't have to be the one making the ask, but there should be a process in place that the board members are aware of. So when they are connecting someone, if they aren't going to make the ask, they can get that person, the potential donor, to the right person. Are you connecting them with the CEO? Is there a VP of advancement? Is there a donor relations employee that they should be connected to?
Yeah, and the more I'm in this business, the more I just understand and appreciate the importance of board members. Their primary job. Look, I know it's oversight. I know it's fiduciary. And I know it's all those things we say, and even I preach. But at the end of the day, what the CEO and executive director need, the organization needs, is you to bring in money. I mean, yes, expertise is important in certain areas, absolutely. But to bring in money either through your own pockets and your organization pockets, or even more importantly, to make introductions to potential donors and funders and relationships that can build and expand and grow. That is really an important role of a nonprofit board.
I got nothing else on that, so I'll move on to my next point, which would be something that I was completely unaware that this even existed, and that is board committees, and that you can even have non-board members on board committees, and that is one of the best ways to recruit future board members, is to get them with that foot in the door mentality. You can come on as a committee member. You're not committing to as much time, as much responsibility, but you can get familiar with the organization. And then hopefully one day down the road, you are willing to accept a board position, commit to a little bit more time, a little bit more responsibility, and be a future board member.
Yeah, it's a great avenue. If structured properly, committee membership, non-board committee membership is a great opportunity for people to serve, provide input, don't have a lot of time. And if you're just testing out the organization, I really encourage everybody to do that. It makes a lot of sense. And I encourage nonprofits, and we're talking, primarily agencies now, to establish committees in that regard. The majority of a committee should be board members, as we heard from Cliff Walters last week, that or in a previous.
They will hear from Cliff Walters next week.
Well, by the time this happens, they will have heard it, right?
This episode's going out first, so
Okay, folks. So this is why you let you let the admin people, I agree, do what they do, and you shouldn't get out of your swim lanes. I'm gonna get back into my swim lane now, and say that yeah, committee membership and majority board members though is a great avenue. I'll be quiet now. Next topic.
All right, so this is another item that they will hear about with Cliff Walters, and that is that, well, first to preface this, I guess I kind of, before all of this working experience, I guess I kind of understood the relationship between the CEO and the board, and that the board is the boss of the CEO, but without being in the meetings, like it's really difficult to understand that, and every organization is different, but every board should be conducting a CEO evaluation on an annual basis for a few reasons, I think. And number one is, if you have a high-performing CEO, they want to know what they could be doing better and are doing well already. They want the feedback. They're high performers for a reason. And then two, if you maybe have a less than stellar CEO, you need to start giving them feedback. So if you do have to move on from them in the future, you've given them that opportunity. There's no, random firings. There's no upset feelings, I would say. Like, you cover your bases as a board by doing your duty to, give feedback to the CEO and help them do a better job.
Yeah, I think that's, any high performer wants feedback, but also it engages the board. And if the board members understand they're going to have to assess the CEO, hopefully they'll pay a little bit more attention, be a little bit more engaged throughout the year. Nothing's worse than somebody going, I don't know what I should score them, rate them. Well, come on, board member, that's your job. That's another responsibility. And, disregarding that as an abdication and really doesn't help the organization. I mean, this is serious stuff. This CEO has 15 bosses, essentially. That's complex. That's that's inherently problematic. But it's what the structure, the legal structure requires. And, they want that feedback. They should be assessed. And you need to have that for continuity, because the board chair is going to change in a year or two. And so if you want to, you need a historical documentation of the performance of the CEO. So yes, absolutely, Reed. Good point. We need to assess our CEOs.
And I think that the complexity of it is something that you're not aware of until you step into the environment. Is so, like, does each board member have equal say in the CEO's evaluation? These are all things that I thought, like, does the board chair have ultimate say? Like, does the executive committee, who has the most say and who's really the boss? And all of these things are very ambiguous, it feels like, unless there's a real mature organization with structure and processes, or a kick-butt CEO who really moves the needle. So those are all of my thoughts.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with that. It's kind of crazy, you think about it. So I got 15 bosses, just using that number 15, primarily for, agencies, community foundations, may have a little bit more, various funders, whatnot, and some of those bosses may only have been on there a year, others 6 years, some 6 months, less interaction. And so, yeah, do they have an executive committee that does, a governance committee that might have some involvement in it? The chair, the chair has regular discussions with the CEO, certainly knows that person and their accomplishments the best. You really want to have a defined process for all of this. It gives your CEO, your executive director, at least a fighting chance, right? A fighting chance to perform and know where he or she stands.
Yeah. And I completely forgot about tenure length. And if they've been on a committee beforehand, they have even more experience with the organization, and the CEO's been there for X amount of time. The board members have been there for different amounts of time and seen turnover and rode the waves of success or failure. And we have the whole episode about it's an art, and it definitely is a dance. It's a tango or whatever.
Which is why it's so important, Reed, that the board hire the right CEO and executive directors. The right expectations are in place on both sides, CEO and the board. the board governance, the board operations, that all the expectations have got to be clear, because there's just too much room, as I said before, for chaos.
Yeah. And to learn more about that, you can go listen to our episode with Charlie Murphy, who has been on a bunch of recruiting committees for new CEOs. And David Fink even talks about it from hiring your first executive director CEO, what their main, goals were for that individual. And defining that role is just as important in the nonprofit world as it is everywhere else.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and arguably more for the reasons we stated. It's a little bit different situation. I can't imagine in the for-profit sector, when I was president of a company, having 15 bosses. I just wow. Yes, you might have a private board, but boy, it's just, I just can't even imagine. So it's certainly challenging for these folks.
And then that just made me remember another point, like 15 bosses that you don't work with every day, who come in maybe once a month, or if they're at the board chair, you maybe talk to them once a week. But 15 remote bosses, basically, who are different levels of engagement. It's quite, I could not imagine being the CEO of a nonprofit organization with all that.
No, and think about it, in a diverse board, which everybody aspires to, but that creates, inefficiencies, right? From initially, I mean, you're always seeking different new people that otherwise would not be in the same room together. So as a CEO, as a board chair, you really have to manage that, be intentional about it. There's beauty in that, and there's so many benefits, but it is inherently challenging, and you've got to be willing to accept that challenge. And so it's an interesting dynamic.
And just one more layer on top of that, maybe this isn't related, but the CEO or CEOs of nonprofits are often people who had a ton of success in the program area and maybe are not managers or leaders. And then they have all of this going on. And I think that's another reason why the board is so important, because they probably are leaders of organizations and are able to help provide some growth in that aspect of maybe a CEO, executive director who has not led a whole organization before and who is coming from a programmatic aspect.
Yeah, depending on the size of the organization, we see that a lot in the smaller ones. The larger ones, a little bit more professionalization. That's natural. It's not right or wrong. It's just the way it is. But your point, I think you made a point without knowing you made that point, that the board ought to look for opportunities to develop their executive directors or CEOs, to carve out funds for professional and personal development. It happens in the for-profit sector because it can only make that individual better, which can only make the organization better. I see so many most don't, because look, they're operating on limited funds. I get it, and they want to use their funds judiciously to help the people or the animals they're trying to help. But it would be very strategic to say, we're going to carve out X dollars every year for, whatever, a coach, go to development, leadership training, whatever, to help this person be more effective. Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about, and let's not also God bless it, there are board members of people willing to serve, because that's what makes this such an interesting and wonderful model, and people taking the time. And when they come on, they don't know their role. They don't know how they can contribute. They want to contribute. So it's important to work with them, to give them an opportunity to make a difference in the organization. Yes, you got to follow the right, rules, regulations, whatnot, processes, but it's when I come on, how can I contribute? How can I best contribute? What are the expectations of me?
Yeah, definitely. And as we always say, there's no school to go to learn how to be a nonprofit board member. So it's through trial and error, and hopefully you have more successes than failures, I would say.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Good point. So, Rita, I know you went through your points. And through this discussion, is there anything else you've thought about as it comes to serving on a nonprofit board?
I guess I would just reiterate that although there's all this complexity, and maybe it's not always fun to hear that, you have to donate or you have to connect to an organization with people. Everybody who comes on says that they love it. Most people do it are board members for more than one organization. And I think that, some of these initial fears you grow out of once you realize that you're doing it for the right reasons. Hopefully you're doing it, you love the organization, so that's why you are willing to connect people to it. It's a great it's great for you, so it'll be great for other people. And we haven't talked to anybody, but also it might be hard to get them to come on the podcast if for people who have said that it has not been worth their time, that they have not gotten as much out of it as they have put into it. So I think that is just something that has stuck with me, that everybody has, recommended it and, gets a lot of joy out of it.
And you're right about that. Maybe we do need to interview somebody, try to find somebody. I think it just probably would be not a right fit for a board, or frustration with something. Everybody that we've interviewed so far, now granted, we've interviewed them because they are at a certain level and they've got tenure, but they're all successful outside of the nonprofit sector. All of them have been successful in other areas. They don't have to serve on boards. Even the executive directors or CEOs we've talked to, they could easily be in the for-profit sector. And they talk about that. Most of them started off in that space. And when you listen to them, there's just a passion. But, I think with that, where I'm going with that is if you're a business person and you're busy, you think you don't have time, I think the development opportunity certainly supersedes the amount of time you put into it, and your return would be greater than you think otherwise. I'm not so sure I've seen anybody who's sat on a lot of boards who's not successful in their careers. Maybe that's a better way to put it. So there's got to be something there. I'm sure there's probably a study or something. I'm not going to conduct it, but I'm sure there's something there.
Yeah. And I guess something else that has just popped into my mind is the difference between some of these, for board members to be aware of the difference between larger boards and smaller boards, more established organizations versus less established. We've worked with both boards who need their board members to be active. They only have 6, 7 people. And then we have boards with 50 people and who it's impossible to have them all be, extremely engaged. So people sit on boards for different reasons. And sometimes that reason is for your organization, and sometimes it's for your time, treasures, and talents.
Well, hopefully every time it's for that, time, treasures, and talents. And yeah, that makes sense. And it's just also maturation, the size of the board. They're all volunteer boards, they're governance-based boards, they're fundraising boards. It really becomes, that's why you ask so many questions, but before you join the board, understand what the roles and expectations are. So very, very well stated, Reed. Anything else, Reed, before we wrap up today?
That's everything from me.
All right, that was a lot of fun. Riffing with Reed, as opposed to recapping with Reed. This was Riffing with Reed. How about that? Just keep up with the new title for this podcast. This is Michael Corley and Reed Corley on the I-501CU, the podcast for nonprofit board members. Thank you for listening, everybody, and we will I-501 see you next week.